almost the exact same words describing his concerns to his brother Bobby. He kept worrying about some kind of screw up, some miscommunication, that things are going to get out of control. And as we go through the slide presentation, you'll see that's exactly what happened. And not only was it a military threat to the United States having the missiles in Cuba, but Kennedy said it's a political threat. He said, if I don't get them out of Cuba, I think I'll be impeached. And I believe he was right. I don't think the American public would have stood for it at the time. I learned a lot about Cuba during the research. I didn't know what a big island it was, 780 miles across. I didn't know where the Bay of Pigs was. I learned where Guantanamo Bay is. And as you'll see, as we started to uncover more information about the military buildup in Cuba, the Soviets didn't have just missiles, say, outside of Havana, but they were scattered throughout the whole island. So I said I was going to introduce you to the characters, and this is the very first one. This is U-2 pilot Jerry McIlmoyle. And Jerry was the rookie pilot of the group, only 32 years old. And he's a key player in the book, partly because Jerry lives in Venice, Florida, and is 90 years old. And I worked with him for several years, and he was instrumental in putting the facts together for the book. And he has quite a story to tell as well. His boss was Major Rudy Anderson, that you see a photo. And Rudy was an interesting character. He really was a pacifist. Even though he flew fighter jets and was in the Korean War, he would always volunteer for reconnaissance work because he really didn't want to kill people, but he thought he could serve his country in a different way, and that was through reconnaissance. And so he was a natural to be recruited into the U-2 spy plane program. Chuck Maltzby is another pilot you're going to get to know, and Chuck was an interesting character to research as well. He also fought in the Korean War, was in a fighter jet, was shot down by the Chinese, and spent 3 years basically in an earthen hole, 4 feet by 5 feet, if you could believe it, and survived. And when we and the Chinese did the POW exchange, I figured Chuck would get out of the military altogether after that experience. But incredibly, he stays in the Air Force. Then the CIA recruits him into the U-2 program, and he's back flying again. He joins the Thunderbirds, a very talented pilot, and you're going to see he plays an unusual role during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I knew President Kennedy would be an important character in the book, but I didn't realize just how important. And the reason I say that is I thought I'd be working off archives of what the president did and why he made the decisions, but it turned out to be much better than that, because he left a series of audio tapes where he secretly recorded every meeting that he held on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's about 100 hours of tape recordings. Old-fashioned tape players recorded it. Now it's digitized. I quickly learned in the research, though, that it wasn't the optimum way to get into the president's mind by listening to these tapes, because you oftentimes couldn't tell who was talking. But I found a book called The Kennedy Tapes. The thing's about 3 inches thick, and it tells you who's saying what during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in the more dramatic exchanges during the meetings, I would quote directly from the people speaking to the president and the president's replies. So as I mentioned, the crisis begins when Steve Heiser discovers the missiles on his flight. But again, this is old-fashioned film, so it had to be analyzed. And then Kennedy's informed while he's having breakfast on October 16th. One of his first questions was, how do you know there's nuclear missiles? I can't see them. And the head of the photographic lab said, we are enhancing these photos, and I've seen some of the enhancements and enlargements, and we can give you 100% assurance that what we're looking at are nuclear missiles. And it was interesting that the CIA housed that lab in a secret location. It was in Washington, D.C., but it was above a used car dealership. So you had the flight suits made in a bra factory and the photo lab above a used car dealership. So one of the president's first questions was, when will the missiles be operational? He basically wants to know, how much time do I have to take action? And the best guesstimate he was given was roughly 10 to 14 days, and that turned out to be very accurate. The warheads were not on top of the missiles yet, but the warheads were right there in the same locale as the missiles. So his second big decision is, who's going to be on my team? Who am I going to pick to advise me? And he called it the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. And it was interesting, he would pick people that you would expect, like the head of the CIA, but then there was the head of the Treasury there, and you're like, why would the Treasury need to be there? And it turned out Kennedy was looking for the best and the brightest minds. So sometimes they were people from different fields that would be part of this XCOM. And it wasn't all yes men either. There were, like McCone, the head of the CIA, was a Republican, but Kennedy trusted him. And so you had a mix. So here they are during the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the interesting things about the tape recordings was he never told this team of advisors that they were being tape recorded. You see Bobby Kennedy standing up over on the left there. He's probably the only one that knew. The two brothers were as close as could be. So it'd be my guess that Bobby Kennedy knew about the secret tapes. And the microphones were held in the bookcases that you see in the background there. So the next pilot to fly after Steve Heiser was Major Rudy Anderson. And it takes about 40 minutes to fly from McCoy Airfield, which was in Orlando, and to be over Cuba. And then you do a run, usually right down the center of the island, and flicking your camera on and off, depending on what targets you were told to film. There are no weapons on the U-2. So again, just reconnaissance. And you're not in any radio communication. But the pilots and our military was well aware that the Soviets had radar tracking capabilities. So each time a U-2 came over Cuba, the Soviets had a giant screen, and they could track where these pilots were and what sites they were flying over. So when Rudy came back and his film was analyzed, that's when we started to realize, well, there's more than just nuclear missiles outside of Havana and San Cristobal. There's other sites as well. So the crisis is ramping up. It's worse than we originally thought. The U-2 was quite an aircraft, and I was surprised to learn how quickly it went from the idea of developing a U-2 to the actual aircraft and test flights. And here you see one of the enhancements they made. The wings were so long, in excess of 90 feet, that they would sometimes scrape on the runway during takeoff. So they put these little pogo sticks underneath them. And then when the plane would get airborne just a foot or two, these pogo sticks were not firmly attached. They would fall away, and the U-2 could fly off. And when it landed, it had expended some of its fuel, so the wings weren't quite as heavy, and a support van would follow. But they were making enhancements all the time to the U-2, including radar tracking capabilities a little bit later to warn the pilots of any missiles being shot in their direction. So the base of the U-2s for the Cuban Missile Crisis turned out to be Orlando, McCoy Airfield. That's not where they were normally housed. They were in different areas of the country. Many were in Del Rio, Texas. But they wanted to move them close to Cuba because the one weakness of the U-2 spy plane photography was it could not pierce cloud cover. So you had to have good weather. And so you had a short window of opportunity to fly over Cuba, particularly in October, when you've got hurricane season. And so whenever the weather was clear, we'd fly as many U-2s as we could to, again, get our reconnaissance. There's a kind of a funny story behind this slide. You see Kennedy in his favorite rocking chair. And in the book, we did talk about President Kennedy's military service and his experience on PT 109, because it does play a role in his thinking that he had seen men die in combat. Because in the early stages of the XCOM meetings, on day 1 and 2, it looks like Kennedy's going along with the majority who say, we need to bomb Cuba in a massive airstrike immediately and probably follow it up with a D-Day style invasion. And if you analyze the Kennedy tapes, and again, we put that exchange in the book, Kennedy's going along with that and they're making preparations. But as a couple more days goes by, he's starting to think it through, and he's saying things like, well, we might think differently when the blood starts flowing. In other words, he's seen the combat and it's going to be horrific. And he starts to think this could be the first step to nuclear war. Millions of innocent people are going to die. So that's breaking into their mindset of, oh, we're just going to launch this airstrike and we'll be done with it. He's starting to look at it from the Russian point of view. But in this photo, I just wanted to mention you have the Russian foreign minister and the Soviet ambassador there with Kennedy, and the topic of Cuba comes up. Now, Kennedy has not told the American people or anybody that we know there's missiles in Cuba. And these two Russians say to the president, yes, we have a military buildup there, but we can assure you, Mr. President, there's no offensive weapons and certainly no nuclear weapons. And as soon as the meeting breaks up and they leave, Kennedy turns to Bobby and he goes, I can't believe they lied straight to my face. He goes, it was all I could do not to walk over to my desk and pull out the photos and shove it under their noses. But he couldn't tip his hand yet because he hasn't decided what to do. So he's delaying, if you will, knowing he's got that little bit of time before the warheads are on the missiles. And that was a big value of the U-2s. They were able to give that indication. Curtis LeMay, some of you probably recognize this photo. He's the head of Strategic Air Command in the Air Force at the time. He was all for the immediate bombing of Cuba, and he and the president get in a couple arguments during XCOM. And one, it gave you a glimpse into Kennedy's leadership style, that he wasn't afraid to have people argue with him and point out a different point of view. And I was kind of amazed that he never kicked LeMay out of the meetings, because at one point LeMay said, you're looking really weak. And then another time he goes, what you're doing is worse than the appeasement of Munich. And then finally, LeMay goes, Mr. President, you're in a bad fix. And Kennedy goes, what did you say? And LeMay goes, I said you're in a bad fix. And the president kind of diffuses the tension and he goes, well, you're in it with me. In other words, we're on the same team. We are arguing for a massive airstrike. And Kennedy would come back at LeMay and go, well, don't you think the Russians are going to respond if we kill a bunch of Soviet troops in Cuba? And LeMay goes, no. And Kennedy goes, why do you say that? And LeMay goes, because we're stronger than the Russians are right now, and they know it. And there's no better time for there to be a war than right now, because we have the upper hand. And Kennedy's thinking nuclear war is a terrible thing to contemplate. But LeMay was all for massive airstrikes immediately. And in LeMay's defense, he was saying we should do it now because we have the element of surprise. The Russians don't know that we know the missiles are there. But Kennedy frustrates LeMay by saying, no, we're going to do the blockade of the ships, the quarantine, they called it, if you will. And, you know, Kennedy's thinking was, this may not work, as a lot of advisors told him, but he said, that's okay. It still gives me the option to ramp things up further. This could be just the first step. And I find in decision making, it's so much better to implement your plan in phases. And that's what he was trying to do. He didn't want to go in right to the airstrikes because Kennedy thought that would lead immediately to all-out war. Now, he does throw the military a bone, if you will. I'm not sure if that's the right phrase, but he gives them something in return. He says, if the Russians shoot down a U-2, I promise you I'll give you the authorization to go in and wipe out the surface-to-air missile site that did that. And then he tells the nation on TV, and as I mentioned before, his big concern is that somehow this is going to slip out of his control. You can pull up Kennedy's speech to the nation on YouTube, and I think you'll be quite impressed, as I was, that he struck a balance of, one, how serious this is, saying that if the Soviets make any military move, they're going to be met with a full retaliatory strike from the United States. But he kept his demeanor calm. So although anxiety was sky high in the U.S. once he did the speech, I never came across instances of total panic. You know, there was never looting of grocery stores. People were definitely stocking up for supplies and things like that. And I would interview people and they'd say, oh yeah, it was tense. One woman had a story I'll never forget. She said, I was, you know, just a schoolgirl, went to school that day after the president's speech. Everything was normal, except at the end of the day, she said, the teacher said, no homework tonight because there may not be a tomorrow. And that story always stuck with me. What a way to tell the kids. But I heard similar stories that the anxiety, even though there was never all-out panic, was through the roof. People knew how grave this was. People were digging bomb shelters in their backyard. You know, and one of the reasons that anxiety was sky high was the headlines the next day where the Soviets responded that, hey, a blockade is illegal and you're putting us on the path to nuclear war. As the crisis went on, say about maybe the crisis was, 13 days? So the middle of the time period, you had the U-2s being supplemented by a low-flying jet, the Navy Crusaders. These were amazing that they could get great photography flying at 500 miles per hour at treetop level. And their photos were even better than the U-2s. In this one, you could see right in the center of the picture is the big tent that houses the nuclear missiles. And just in this one site, just the Soviet military buildup. Look at all the trucks and fueling equipment there, you know, barracks. And not in this photo, but outside the scene would be the trapezoidal configuration of surface-to-air missiles protecting this site. I want to make sure if everything's okay. I see a little sign here. It says you just stopped, but I think we're okay. The secretary, the ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, played an important role because he's the one who kind of unveiled what the U.S. was doing to the country. He trotted out some of the photos, and it kind of reminded me of Colin Powell when our intelligence was faulty, saying, you know, Iraq has major weapons of mass destruction. But in this case, our intelligence was good. And Adlai Stevenson, by the way, was the first person to tell Kennedy, we should consider removing our missiles out of Turkey and making a deal with the Russians that way. And Kennedy originally did not like that idea. After Stevenson left the Oval Office, he said to Bobby, whose side is Adlai on anyways? But yet that does become one of the solutions to the crisis. So the Soviets are going to protect these missile sites, but Khrushchev has given the word, do not shoot down any U.S. aircraft. And his thinking is, we've almost got the warheads on the missiles, then we're going to have the United States over a barrel. And in Khrushchev's words, they're going to know how it feels to have missiles on their doorsteps, because we had missiles on the Russian doorstep. But his fear that somebody on the ground was going to do something without his authorization came true. Jerry McIlmoyle was doing a flight over Cuba, and towards the tail end of his flight, after he had just photographed a target near Banyas, Cuba, he's turning back, and he said, in my rearview mirror, and I said, you two has a rearview mirror? And he goes, oh yeah. He said, I could see a contrail coming up towards me, and then a starburst. So the surface-to-air missile had been fired. It had blown up. I said, what'd you do? He said, I did what I'm trained to do, and that's to get photos. He said, the plane was already banking for home. He said, I just had to make a couple minor adjustments, get the camera on, and I got the second one and the first starburst on film. And I said, well, then what? He said, I got the hell out of there. And he lands back in McCoy, and of course he's debriefed by the Air Force and the CIA. He tells them what's happened. He then goes back to his barracks and he tells the other U-2 pilots, they're firing at us now. He said, you're going to be able to see it on the film once it gets developed. And then something really unusual happened, and I found this part of the story so kind of gripping that Jerry survives it, and then this unusual incident occurs that I open the above and beyond. This is the opening chapter, and then we kind of backtrack and get you to the peak of the crisis. But the next day, he's on the tarmac, and he hears somebody shout his last name, McIlmoyle, and he turns around, and it's a 3-star general. And he goes, yes, sir. And the general goes, we've examined your film, and there's nothing on it. And Jerry goes, sir, I'm sure I got the contrail and the starburst on film. And the general goes, not only was there nothing on your film, but we've destroyed your intelligence report because you were obviously mistaken. And Jerry goes, I know what happened, sir. It's on the film. And finally, the general goes, do you understand what I'm telling you? In other words, zip it up. This has never happened. We don't want this to get out. Jerry and I don't know for sure who ordered this or why. We suspect they didn't want it to get to Kennedy because he might suspend the U-2 overflights, not wanting another Gary Powers situation. But the military, needed these U-2 overflights. If we're going to do an invasion, and that's still on the table, we need as much intel as we could get. And it was really something. And in the book, you'll read how Jerry became a brigadier general later, and was able to track down the photo analyst who analyzed his film, and he confirmed that, oh yeah, your film did have the contrails on it and did have the starburst. And so I showed Jerry this photo. I said, is that what the starburst looked like? And he said, well, really what happens is after it explodes, the big telephone pole SAM missile, the shrapnel, if you will, goes in all directions. So it would be shooting out from this explosion in all directions. And all it would take would be one piece of shrapnel to take down a U-2, because they're a very lightweight, kind of flimsy, kind of a temperamental aircraft. A lot of pilots who went through the program washed out because they were so difficult to fly. So Jerry's incident happened on Thursday, and then 2 days later on Saturday, which would be day 13 of the crisis, that was the darkest day of all. And there's three more incidents that almost caused nuclear war, and I'll briefly go through those. By the way, the president was young. Off the top of my head, I think he might have been 45 at the time. Quite a burden. But one of the incidents occurred with Soviet sub B-59. We had told the Soviets that if your subs approach the quarantine line and we find them, we're going to let them know we've located them by dropping dummy or practice depth charges down, and they should immediately come to the surface and turn back. This is their warning. Well, whether the commander of B-59 got that message or not, we'll never know for sure, but he thinks he's being bombed with live depth charges. And it wasn't just one or two depth charges. The sailors on the sub later testified in a Soviet report that they said it felt like we were inside an oil drum and somebody was taking a big sledgehammer to it. And finally, after it was, I want to say, 3 or 4 hours of these depth charges going off, the commander of B-59 says, load the special torpedo into firing tube number 3. And the special torpedo turns out to be the one torpedo on board these Foxtrot subs that had a nuclear warhead. So he's going to take out the aircraft carrier and the destroyers in the area. And it's just by luck that he doesn't do it. And the luck was in the form of another person on the sub, Sergei Arkhipov, that you see here. Sergei did not have control of the sub, but he was of equal rank to the commander. So Sergei was the coordinator of the Foxtrot subs. There are 4 of them. And Sergei says, no, we don't have authorization to fire any nuclear weapons. We don't even know if World War III is broken out, if these are live depth charges. And they get in an argument, and a couple other officers take Sergei's side, and they're able to calm B-59's commander down enough that he doesn't fire the sub. And he eventually does come to the surface and turns back from the quarantine line. But I shudder to think what might have happened if Sergei Arkhipov didn't happen to be on that particular sub as the coordinator. So earlier I introduced you to Chuck Maltzby, and Chuck's up in Alaska, so you figure what's he got to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, he's told, do a flight over the North Pole. Your U-2 is equipped with special carbon filters that you're going to do a radioactive sampling. It's going to be a night flight. It's going to be difficult. There's only been one done before Chuck's that goes all the way over the North Pole and then back to Alaska. And so they plan for every contingency because it's a very difficult flight. He's going to be in the air for 7 hours. But the one thing they didn't plan for was the northern lights, because Chuck is flying by celestial navigation. There is no GPS back in 1962. There's no land masses he can look down at to see where he is at night. So he's going to be flying by the stars, and now he can't see the stars. So somewhere near the North Pole, he aborts his mission and tries to retrace his flight path back to Eisen Air Force Base. And as you see in this slide, Eisen Air Force Base, his last radio contact was over Barter Island as he's heading towards the North Pole. But on his return trip, he veers far to the west, unknowingly. And Chuck said, I knew I was in trouble when I was fiddling with the radio, trying to get, a frequency for Barter Island when I picked up Russian music. Never a good a good sign. So he's realized he strayed over Russian airspace. Again, the Russians have the radar capability to see him come in over their airspace, and they don't know what this is. They think this could be the vanguard of a U.S. attack on the homeland. So they send up Soviet MiGs to shoot down whatever this is. Normally, the MiGs can't reach the U-2, but Chuck is in the cockpit and he's looking at his fuel gauge and it's almost on empty. And he's got a really difficult decision to make. And I won't tell you this whole story because I want there to be surprises in the book for you. But he looks at his fuel gauge and he realizes, I'm not going to have enough fuel to get back towards Alaska. The sun is starting to come up, so he's got a better feel which way is east. And he decides the only thing to do is to shut the plane down and glide, conserve fuel. Now, when he does that, he's going to lose pressure in the cockpit. And so he's putting all his marbles that the pressure suit will work. And it does. But his face shield ices up and he's having trouble seeing. He doesn't know these MiGs are coming up at him. He also doesn't know that word of his situation has got back to Eisenhower Air Force Base, and we've launched fighter jets to engage the MiGs, and all this is happening over that Chuckatuck Peninsula. But it's like something out of a James Bond movie, all the different moving pieces of what happens during Chuck's flight. So that's one part I want to hold back so there'll be a surprise. Now, by coincidence, at the very moment Chuck is in trouble, Rudy Anderson he's volunteered. He hasn't been ordered. He's volunteered for another mission, and he launches. So again, this is coming out of Florida to fly over Cuba for another surveillance mission. And it's going to be a long flight because he's going to fly the whole length of Cuba and shoot 4 different targets. And the Soviets are tracking him, and one of the Soviet generals goes, "Our guest has overstayed his welcome." And the other general goes, "Let's get permission to shoot him down." So they try to get a hold of the Soviet Supreme Commander there in Cuba, and he's sick as a dog. They can't get a hold of him. So these 2 lower-ranking generals feel they have the authority to shoot him down. They think World War III is imminent, and they were right. This is Saturday. We were set to do the massive airstrikes on that Monday if the quarantine wasn't working. And so far, the Russians had not removed the missiles. So without authorization, they tell the surface air missile site at Banyas, Cuba, and these were the words the Russians used. They said, "Destroy target number 33. And again, they're tracking it on this giant radar screen. And Rudy's flying in a U-2 that has a U.S. Air Force insignia on it. Kennedy was insistent that there be no CIA pilots flying, even though the CIA had pilots trained, to the same capability of our Air Force pilots. But he didn't want CIA pilots involved, probably because of the whole Bay of Pigs fiasco. But now there's a little speculation coming up on my part of what happens to Rudy. But he's down towards Guantanamo Bay when they fire 2 surface air missiles at him. And he is hit. He never gets off a Mayday. He never tries to eject from the plane, because again, that's a possibility. That's what Gary Powers did. And by the way, Eisenhower was assured that no U-2 pilot could ever survive a hit by a SAM or even a partial hit at that high, and then Gary Powers comes out of it alive. But in this case, I kind of went to Jerry McIlmoyle for advice, and I said, "Jerry, if he was hit by a surface-to-air missile or even wounded, why wouldn't his aircraft come down in a million tiny little pieces? I said, because I've finally located the picture I've been searching for months, and that's what the crashed aircraft of Major Rudy Anderson looked like. And in the next picture, this was taken by a Cuban near Banyas on the ground. And, the front part of the aircraft is intact. And I'll never forget the way Jerry described it. He said, if a U-2 is wounded, he said, it's enough to bring it down. And he said, what's going to happen is, first one wing is going to come off as it's falling, then the other, and then the tail. But he said it'll kind of come down like a leaf spiraling down from a tree rather than just plummeting straight to the ground, because it is in essence a glider. And so that's why the fuselage was intact and Major Anderson's body was still in the cockpit. Now, the military knew that he had been shot down within just minutes of what happened, and the Cubans didn't try to hide the fact either. In fact, it was on Radio Havana. We've just taken down one of the imperialist aircraft. But for some reason, they didn't tell the president right away. They waited till the middle of a meeting. And you'll see it in Above and Beyond. They almost bring it up. The military almost brings it up in a casual manner. They go, we lost a plane today. And Bobby goes, what? And they go, yeah, we lost a U-2. And Bobby goes, is the pilot dead? And they go, yes, the pilot's been killed. And then the president goes, well, this is a whole new ball game, because this is our first loss of life. And Curtis LeMay expects the president to now go, okay, go take out that surface-to-air missile sites. You've got jets gassed up, waiting in Key West and Boca Chica. And he doesn't say that. Instead, he says, we're going to adjourn the meeting. And he pulls Bobby aside. And he said, this is going to be the last chance for the Soviets. Go tell them, here's the deal. You've got to remove your missiles from Cuba immediately, and we in turn will promise, one, not to invade the island, and two, at a later date, take our missiles out of Turkey. I can't tell you when, because we've got to work with NATO to do that, but I give you my word that at some point down the road, our missiles will come out of Turkey. Kennedy viewed the missiles in Turkey, by the way, as somewhat redundant, because he said, we've got the Polaris submarines in the Mediterranean with nuclear missiles on them. That's right close where they need to be. So he didn't think he was giving up too much, but he didn't want that made public. It might have made him look a little bit weak in terms of the negotiation. And Sergei Khrushchev, the premier's son, said, when my father got that offer, he jumped at the chance. And I said, why? And he said, his very fear was coming true. Things were spinning out of control. He didn't give the authorization to kill Major Rudy Anderson. He was aware of Chuck Maltby's overflight into the Soviet Union that caused people to think World War III had started. So just like Kennedy, these very things he worried about, the miscommunications and the screw-ups were happening. So LeMay was not happy, and behind Kennedy's back, he goes, he's chickened out again. They killed one of our pilots, and he still hasn't done anything. But again, thank God, in hindsight, Kennedy didn't pull the trigger then and gave the Russians one last chance. So the president goes on TV. He tells his advisors, no gloating. The missiles aren't out of there yet. We don't want them to change their mind. But he does announce that a deal has been reached. He does not mention the missiles in Turkey. Major Anderson's body is returned by the Soviets. Here it is being unloaded at Homestead Air Force Base. You'll see in the book it was really tough on Rudy Anderson's wife. The military at that time, and they may still have it today, if there's a casualty, they ask the family. The family was at Del Rio. he had a couple of young sons, and his wife was pregnant at the time, has to leave the air base. So you're just going through total trauma. And adding to her trauma was a year before this happened, she got a knock on her door, and it was a senior Air Force officer with the chaplain, and they said, "We're sorry to inform you, your husband's been killed in a training accident." Well, they had gone to the wrong U-2 pilot's house. Rudy was fine at that point. Now, when he really is killed and they knock on the door, she doesn't know what to believe because she's gone through this before. So it's just a terrible nightmare that she goes through. And I kind of, we're getting at the end here. I want to end with two little stories. One of which was, I thought the president did something classy. There was so much on his plate when this was over, but he took the time to fly down to Homestead and thank everyone. And Jerry McIlmoyle said, "I was so excited to, meet the president, shake his hand." And then he was informed, "Hey, you're the rookie. You have to stay in the U-2 in the hangar in case, somebody from the president's entourage wants to see what these super secret aircraft look like." So Jerry said, "I'm in the hangar." And after the president spoke, in rolls his limousine right into the hangar. The president gets out and he said, I could hear what he said. And he turned to the other people with him and he said, "You all stay here. I'm going to go up to the cockpit and talk to that young man alone." So I, in the book, with the private conversation that Jerry and the president had for 20 minutes, two combat veterans just alone at the cockpit of the U-2. Kennedy actually climbed up the stairs, and Jerry said he actually sat in the cockpit. I said, "You're kidding. With his bad back?" He said, "Yep, he wanted to get in there and see what it was like." And in summary, there's two lessons I learned about the decision-making of the president and why it worked so well. And one was he implemented the plan in steps. He didn't go for the all-out D-Day style invasion and airstrike first. He did the quarantine because that allowed him the most flexibility. And, that was key. And the other thing was he was very flexible with his plan. And some people might even call it flip-flopping, where he changed his mind about, hey, we'll take out SAMs if they hit one of our U-2s. He did not let Curtis LeMay do that. So the lesson for me was it's great to have goals, but the plan should always be amended as new information is coming in. And in Kennedy's example, he reversed his decision about what to do if a U-2 is shot down, because he knew we were near the end of the time frame of when we either got to attack or the Soviets have to remove them. One of the two things has to happen. So the book is dedicated to that handful of U-2 pilots that knew they were sitting ducks over Cuba, including, of course, Major Rudy Anderson, who gave his life, and to Jerry, where we took this picture at his home. He looks like he could be my father. And really, without Jerry's help, I could not have done the book. He was available 24/7. I would email, I would call, he'd walk me through all my dumb questions. And people would often say to me, "So, where's your little writing spot and what do you use for a writing schedule?" And I say, I have no writing schedule. Sometimes a month will go by, I won't write a thing. Then I'll get in the zone and I'll be writing day in and day out. And the best place to do it is away from your home, away from distractions. And one of my places where I wrote a fair amount of this book was up at the little cabin I have in Woodbury, Vermont. No cell phone reception, no internet, no TV, no nothing. It's the perfect place to get away. And I'm gonna turn it back to Alex for a moment here and we're going to see how the technology works with the questions. Let's see. I actually see one question right here. Curtis LeMay called for bombing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age. That's true. Did he ever indicate what he learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis? I did not come across that. I did come across, some of you might remember this, he was on the presidential ticket. He was going to be the vice president with George Wallace. In my opinion, that would have been a very scary ticket indeed. Here's another one. I was 12 when this happened, and I remember the adults were frightened, and therefore so was I. That's so true. One person I spoke to said as soon as Kennedy informed the nation of what was happening, she said, my father picked up a shovel and started digging the bomb shelter.
All right. Well, I turned on the little survey at the end. So if before you sign off, if you take a second and fill it out, we'd greatly appreciate it. Michael and I will hang out for a few minutes and answer any more questions that might come up. So feel free to think about any questions and go ahead and chat. We'll be here for a little while. And if you are leaving us, I really appreciate you tuning in. Tune in next week. We're going to have Craig Pittman next Wednesday at 6 p.m. talking about our crazy state of Florida. Have a great day.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention, if you go on my website, you can get a discounted copy of Above and Beyond that I can personalize for you as a gift. And the website is just michaeltougias.com, Tougias. Were there any more questions? Oh, here's one. I was on a destroyer escorting the Marine landing force, 44 days at seas. The carrier ran out of toilet paper. But you talk about, if you were in the military at that point, how scary it must have been. So many people said, they couldn't even call their families. They were on these missions that were secret. For example, I talked to someone who flew a B-52, and he said this thing was in the air 24/7. As soon as it touched down, another one would take off. It'd be gassed up, and up we'd go. And on it were nuclear weapons, and we were always airborne. And thank you to, I see some nice comments. Thank you to all of you. And again, thank you to the humanities and Alex. Alex was a big help walking me through the technology, and I'm so happy it all worked.
Yeah, and Michael, there's someone there's an attendee with the name Brigadier General Gerald Eugene. I think this is the Jerry you were referring to all those times.
That's got to be Jerry. Fantastic. Jerry, if you're still there, I will email you as soon as we're off. You could give me your critique of where I might have messed up. I think that's it for the questions, Alex. I don't see any more coming in.
It says there's a few people typing, so we'll give them
a
minute to finish their response here.
Boy, that's pressure having Jerry McIlmoyle, who was there. I didn't know he was on here.
Eric asked, what did Sergey do in the United States?
He was teaching at a university. Yeah, and I was able to track him down. He was gracious enough to walk through my questions. And the part of it that I'll always remember was him saying, my father's fear was this was going to get out of control. And boy, that's almost what happened. I'd like to contact Sergey again because I believe he's a U.S. citizen. How ironic is that?
Wow. All right, we still have someone typing.
Yep. Yeah, the leadership lesson. I see one from Ellen. I do a whole program about leadership lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis because I couldn't help but, doing the research, write down some of the decisions Kennedy was making. And I had come up with 14 steps. So I call it 14 steps to strategic decision making. But the two biggies, the one in particular that I mentioned, make sure your plan is flexible because I've done several books about survival stories, and oftentimes the reason these people are in the survival situation is because they've got this fixed plan, and even though new information is coming in, oftentimes it's weather changing. They go, no, we're on a schedule. We're going to keep going. And boy, that gets you into trouble.
Yeah.
There's a question there. Where are these 14 steps presented? Some of them can be found on my website. And in the book, although I don't identify them in the book, you'll see which ones I really think strongly on, because I kind of digress a little bit in the book to say this was a key step being made here during the XCOM meeting.
All right. Well, we have Steve is typing again.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Well, unless anyone else has any questions, we'll go ahead and sign off. Again, I appreciate everyone tuning in. I encourage you to tune in again next week for next week's program, and have a great rest of your day. And thanks for doing this for us.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Will you take care, Alex?
Thanks. You too.